Sean Hannity Show. More behind-the-scenes information on breaking news and more bold, inspired solutions for America.
Hey, everybody, it's Jay Sekulow sitting in for Sean Hannity. He'll be back Tuesday. You can call us at 1-800-941-SEAN. That's 1-800-941-7326. I'm going to get into the issue of what's happening in Manchester because there's more developments, multiple arrests now in Libya in this terrorist attack, and we've got two great guests to talk about this. Dr. Jasser has been on with Sean many, many times, been on our broadcast as well, former U.S. Navy medical officer and staff physician to the U.S. Congress and Supreme Court's got a great book out called A Battle for the Soul of Islam. And Jordan Sekulow, the executive director of our American Center for Law and Justice, who holds an LLM degree from Georgetown Law School as well. I want to go to both of you first on this. I'll start, Zuhdi, with you, then Jordan. Looking at Manchester, Zuhdi, and thanks for being with us. Let me tell you what's concerning me, and that is, I call the after effect roundup. In other words, you go in, the incident happens, multiple casualties, 22 people dead, a lot of kids, many, many injured, and then the roundup starts. Yet there was a problem with this guy known by authorities in the community, in the mosque itself, and nothing happened.
Jay, it's great to be with you.
You too.
Thanks for having me. And
sure.
You could not be more on target. This is the problem, is that we deal with these in this sort of sound, sonic boom after an effect, and we think that this is the problem. And not only did they miss it, which was the known wolf, this is the guy, one of the 3,500 that was on the radar, but they did not follow through, because the entire mantra or focus of Homeland Security, be it here in America or in Europe, is about violence. If they're not strapping bombs, working on building bombs, then they're supposedly not part of the profile. And unfortunately, it's not just the travel to Libya and Syria that should have tipped them off. It's not just the background, but actually the fact that they were dabbling in ideas that are related to nonviolent Islamism. The imams, the mosque that was preaching anti-Western ideology, anti-Semitism, homophobia, that we're finding out today that the mosque that condemned this act weeks before had sermons that clearly are part of this radicalization profile. And how many of these attacks do we need? Be it Boston, San Bernardino. The San Bernardino shooters were getting training at the Huda school from Salafi jihadism in Pakistan online from California, and no one seemed to think that mattered because it was nonviolent. We have to start paying attention to the nonviolent precursors of these known wolves and also of the rest of the Muslim community.
Well, Jordan, we've talked about this a lot, both in our legal work at the American Center for Law and Justice, and that is, I'm very concerned about what I just was talking to Zuhdi about, and that is this post-justification or post-action that takes place. We've said you've got to be more affirmative, and the president said that as well. He's been very clear about the nature of what we have to do when he talks about push them out of the mosque, push them out of the community. You got to drive them out, push them out.
Well, and if you have the known ISIS connections, and that's what was reported here, the French foreign minister talked about these individuals having the known ISIS connections. So they've had that contact between Islamic State recruiters, whether that's online, in person, whether it happened in Libya, whether it happened in travels in Syria. Any of that contact alone with a known terrorist organization should be enough to execute the arrest. But we've kind of discussed this problem of waiting until they've actually gone violent. I mean, Zuhdi knows this from the military, but we're treating civilians like military members. It's like you can't act until you've been fired at, until the other side. And that's not how we need to operate in civilian life. In civilian life, if you're starting to move towards acting or firing or explosions or bomb making, if you're having those discussions, that is criminal. You don't have a freedom of speech to go back, have a conversation with ISIS. There's no freedoms for that. And in the Western world, we have these ideas of freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. But there aren't freedoms to associate with known terrorist entities or criminal entities, and you can act before the crime has been the bigger crime's been committed, because there were already crimes committed here. Travel, fighting with ISIS already in Libya. I mean, these are 23-year-olds that already have long records of fighting with terrorism, and they didn't do enough to get picked up by the British authorities until after the fact. You know,
Zuhdi, you have said often on this broadcast with Sean, and also in talking with me on our broadcast from Jordan, that this is a problem within the Muslim community, and we have to be able to, the Muslim community has to be able to address this. And the president has said that to the 50 leaders from Muslim countries that were gathered in Riyadh.
I was gratified that President Abbas joined the summit and committed to taking firm but necessary steps to fight terrorism and confront its hateful ideology. And it's so interesting that our meeting took place on this very horrible morning of death to innocent young people. Peace can never take root in an environment where violence is tolerated, funded, and even rewarded.
So, Zudi, that was with Mahmoud Abbas in Bethlehem. And in fact, we know that their violence is tolerated, funded, and rewarded. They get rewards from it, and the American people are paying for it. But you've been calling about this for a long time, that this is significantly an internal Muslim problem.
And I'm so glad you made that connection between Manchester and Riyadh. These two, the acts of terror in Manchester and then the speech the president gave are deeply connected. We have to begin to look at the underbelly of these acts of barbarism. It's not just Manchester. It's not just San Bernardino. It is the entire global Islamist movement that are an ideology that can only be addressed by Muslims. And as much as it was great to see him start a counterterrorism center in Riyadh, it's sort of like starting an anti-cocaine center in Colombia. I mean, really, it's up to Muslims in the West.
No, you're right.
In London and in America to set up centers like that where we can do the work to reform, to counter theocracy that you just can't do in Saudi Arabia because you end up in prison and they're not willing to connect the dots between their Salafism and jihadism, which is militant. So this is why the acts of Manchester need to finally wake up America and the West that, listen, we have to begin to reform and create an anti-theocratic movement and, think Cold War, think Radio Free Europe, and begin to think about how to engage Muslims to counter the establishment of the Muslim community that is the primary reason for these ideas being penetrated into mosques. And the radicalization pathway is not just that last moment when he puts on the belt. It's far before that.
Well, Jordan, that's what you were talking about earlier. So in the way to engage this now, because we have to look at how do we go forward. And I think what the president said was the statements. You're talking about driving them out, get them out. But this has to actually be put into policy. And the political correctness in the United States and in Great Britain, where it's even worse, has really added fuel to this fire.
Yeah, the idea, again, of how many of these attacks before we change our approach, law enforcement agencies change their approach, they stop just leaking out information and being sources to the press and start focusing on keeping us safe. Again, whether it's here in the United States or abroad with our Western allies who are facing this. As Zudi said, they have about 3,500 identified. We have about 1,000 now based on our populations.
How hard is that to follow up?
It seems like with the billions of dollars we all spend in these countries on national security, if you started treating this more like organized crime, and again, obviously knowing that the driving factor is not money, but is the radical religious ideology. And I think that because if it's not changed, and if for instance, if Muslims who are trying to do the right thing call into the law enforcement, and the law enforcement is afraid to do anything about it, and they feel like, okay, why do I keep reporting? But it reaches a critical head at some point in the world. At some point in the world, things will turn worse for everyone. So it's not going to be good for the Islamic community, and it's not going to be good for freedom-loving people around the world, and especially in the West. Because if there is some crackdown more, it's that will be targeted on Islam at a certain point. People will take action to their own hands, and if their governments are not going to protect them from these mass killers.
So, Zudi, what do we do? Let's talk about proactive engagement here, because that's what you've been really dealing with for many years and successfully. But let's talk about proactive engagement to address this, because this is a problem that is now, and this was targeted against kids. And we shouldn't be shocked at this. This is the kind of barbarism that we're dealing with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But let's talk about the proactive engagement of what we need to be doing now as a country, as a people.
Three things. Number one, the president needs to yesterday, when he gets back tomorrow, convene the Commission on Radical Islam. He promised in the campaign that he was going to convene and have leading reformers in the Muslim community be a part of that. Many in the anti-jihad movement be a part of that, to begin to have sort of this Manhattan Project, if you will, that begins to look at how do we create a movement of ideas that are not only anti-ISIS and anti-violent extremism, which is my second point, is stop the violent extremism talk, which is just a symptom, like terrorism is a symptom, and get to countering violent Islamism. So two is to shift the conversation nationally, strategically, a DOD, state, and all across government to counter violent Islamism. And then third, to begin to work with pro-freedom, pro-secularist groups that are reformist in the Muslim community, build platforms so that we can teach our kids that it's far preferable to want to die for America and die for freedom than ever to want to die for the Islamic State and jihadist identity movements. Until we counter these identity movements from a positive perspective, like we did in Radio Free Europe and the advancement of we defeated socialism of the Soviet era by advancing capitalism, not by spreading the ideas that socialism was bad. We defeated them by spreading the wonder of free markets, and that's what we're missing in this war.
So when we look at it, Jordan, taking the next step, and you've written about this and you've talked about this, you have a system in place right now, and we talked about this with the failure in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, where the individual had gone to the FBI. Omar Martin in Orlando on the terror watch list. The Sarnoff brothers interviewed by the FBI
because they're traveled.
Yeah, and here you go in Fort Hood in that situation. So, which the government initially called workplace violence and finally acknowledged that it was terrorism.
Had that contact that could have been enough to put him in prison.
But they instead promoted him and moved him.
Right, kept him going on because of the political correctness. And it's not something that changes overnight because of who you elect as president. The president, as we've seen, has had to deal with what the bureaucracy is like
and the
undermining of his everything he's tried to do. So this, I think, in what like Zudi said, these ideas to implement are going to take a lot of resolve. You have to really be committed to changing a culture. One, not just the culture in the Muslim world, but the culture in the Western world of how to combat this. The culture inside the FBI, the culture inside the CIA, the culture amongst our Western allies, that you can say radical Islamic terrorism in Riyadh with the Saudis, and they're not shaking their heads and huffing and puffing about it. But in America, you've got a lot of Islamic leaders who do.
Yeah.
And I think that's because they are used to, again, exploiting the freedoms that we have in the West to our own detriment.
Zudi, I got just about a minute here. On that issue, the president made those strong statements in Riyadh, was very direct, but yet, as Jordan just said, the FBI manual takes out radical Islamism. Don't want to talk about jihad. We've got to change that culture, too.
We absolutely do. And we have to, because the reason you identify, if you want to engage Muslims, you engage us because the elephant in the room is the Islamic interpretations. And the diversity in the Islamic community is not ethnic of Pakistani, Egyptian, or Western Muslims. It's a diversity of ideas. And right now, there's a single monolith. And what I hope the president does in future speeches is speaks past the establishment, the corrupt establishment of the Arab tyrannies, and speaks to the Arab people, because the future of this cultural revolution we have to see that America, I think, can lead, like the civil rights movement of our day, within the Muslim community, is one of representing individual rights against blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, the persecution of minorities, etc. That's what we need to have a drumbeat of every day, not just for a week after each barbaric attack.
Jordan, 15 seconds here. This is a war we win if we put our mind to it. If we put into place the policies and practices, we can win this.
We can win this, but we have to change. We have to change our mindset, our policies, and our practices. All of that has to be changed, or else this has continued on. It was before 9/11. And it's been 16 years, and it continues to change. We have to fight back in all the tools that we have.
All right, Zudi Jasser, Jordan Sekulow. We'll be back with more. This is Jay Sekulow in for Sean Hannity.